AP government, the bureaucracy. All right, there are three sort of branches of bureaucracy. The first is called the Executive Office of the President, or EOP for short. This is essentially the president's right arm. They take care of day-to-day business, and they are the closest advisors and the closest people to the president. First is the White House office. That includes the press secretary and the chief of staff. The chief of staff obviously runs the staff on a day-to-day basis. The press secretary meets every single day or close to it with the members of the press to answer questions and to give particular statements. So the press secretary, his name's Jay Carney right now, the press secretary is an important mouthpiece, so to speak, for the president, because the president's not going to do that every day, and yet the press and the people want information. So anytime that you read an article in the news or hear in the news about, the Obama administration says blah blah blah, that's actually a statement that's been put out by the press secretary. The OMB, or Office of Management and Budget, is in charge of the federal budget, so they distribute dollars and everything else, and they also very often make proposals for the president to see, and he can decide ultimately, but they're in charge of the day-to-day activities. The National Security Council, or the NSC, is an advisory body about world issues. They meet, depending on the president, weekly or daily, and sometimes the NSC is, who is involved in that is up to the president. So the Secretary of State sometimes is in there, sometimes not. The Secretary of Defense is almost all the time. The Vice President may or may not be in the NSC. The National Economic Council evaluates the economy and makes statements about how the economy is doing. Then there are a handful of others that are of less importance. The next is the Cabinet. The Cabinet is an advisory body and carries out the president's wishes. So they serve a handful of functions, as we'll mention in a little bit. Each department's headed by the secretary of blah, blah, blah. So sometimes you hear secretary and you think about a menial job or a recording job, but that's just not the case with these people. There is agriculture, commerce, defense. These are extremely sort of powerful groups that implement laws about agriculture or implement laws about commerce. The Department of Defense includes the military, the Department of Education, the Department of Energy, Health and Human Services, HUD, Housing and Urban Development. The Secretary of the Interior is in charge of all federal lands throughout the country, which in the West is a significant portion. Some states in the West have the majority landholder in those states is the government. So the Department of Justice is the department that has an enormous amount of police and lawyers involved in it. The Department of Labor deals with the labor relations in the country, the wages and the work safety. The Department of State is actually a foreign policy position. So Department of Defense and Department of State are largely the foreign policy cabinet posts. The Secretary of State serves as a representative of the United States overseas, spends a lot of his time or her time overseas. Recent Department of State or Secretaries of State have been Hillary Clinton and then currently John Kerry, both of which have run for President of the United States. So that shows you the importance of that position. Department of Transportation deals with roadways and other transportation issues in the air and in the sea. Department of Treasury deals with the money, obviously, in the United States, the printing of it, etc. Department of Veterans Affairs deals with foreign military personnel. And the most recently created Department of Homeland Security that was implemented after September 11th to make homeland defense against terrorism and other activities more unified and more sort of there was a lot of overlapping before that had occurred, that the Department of Homeland Security sort of unified all of the services so that they would be able to communicate with each other. The last one, don't make fun of me for my PowerPoint issues. For some reason, I couldn't get this to go one at a time. Sorry. The last one is independent agencies, not under direct control of the president. Usually they're either too expensive or too important to be political in nature. A lot of them are regulatory commissions, like the Securities and Exchange Commission, which deals with the stock market. So if you are a big-time CEO or anything like that, you have to file with the Securities and Exchange Corporation when you purchase stocks. Or if you are a corporation who actually sells or has distributed stocks, you must file a lot of information with the SEC. The Federal Trade Commission deals with the same thing, but in a broader sense as far as trade between countries and within the United States. Then there are some government corporations which act like corporations. They operate at a profit or a loss, mostly a loss, right? The U.S. Postal Service and Amtrak are both deemed to be important enough to the country that they should be controlled by the government, but yet as opposed to a private company. Both of them do operate at a loss. Independent executive agencies such as NASA and CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, which is sort of broadly focused around gathering information around the world. So there are basically three distinguishing things about bureaucracies. What is it, right? Essentially, it's a hierarchical authority. They're based on a pyramid structure, so they have a chain of command. They have people on the very bottom. The vast majority of people that work in bureaucracy are doing sort of small tasks, often repetitively. You can think about it as a factory of implementing laws. And then they have managers over them, and they have managers over them. Oftentimes you can tell what type of manager it is or how high up they are by sort of how long in the future, how distant in the future the decision has to be made. If the decision has to be made right now and there's something to do, fill out a piece of paper, make a decision, write a check, etc., you're going to be low on the totem pole. If you're making decisions for a year, 2 years down the road, then you're higher up. Each bureaucrat has a special duty, has a special job, and each one has specific rules that they must follow in order to do the job correctly and in order to do the job sort of efficiently as well. So the bureaucracy a lot of times, and as Lowy puts it, is really, it's an amazing feat of human nature. We have this gigantic task. The United States government has a gigantic task to deal with to implement laws. Over 310 million people. It's a gigantic country. It's a gigantic amount of people, and yet we're able to take apart all of the different jobs and delegate it between people to create a system that actually works. Who leads it? So there are basically four organizational categories: the departments, independent agencies, independent regulatory commissions, and government corporations, Amtrak, Postal Service, etc. So that's a different way to parse out the cabinet or the bureaucracies. The departments obviously are the same. The independent agencies are the same. The regulatory commissions and government corporations are both of those independent agencies as well. Headed by presidential appointees, they're called political executives. There are 7,000 senior bureaucrats, SES, who don't leave with new presidents. Basically, they're career executives. That's what they do. They work in the government, and it doesn't matter who's elected or who isn't as far as their specific job. Now, people who are elected in Congress, people may decide to eliminate that job, but that is not something that is appointed and changes. There are 2.7 million executive branch employees of the 15 departments, 50 independent agencies, and 2,000 plus bureaus. Bureaus are just parts within each one of those agencies. A large, complex society or business bureaucracy is inevitable. Number of bureaucratic leaders has grown dramatically over time. And the question that was posed in class is, why do you think that is? And mostly it's because of the increased government role in our society, in the American society. we as citizens want to go about our business of living our life, making our money, et cetera, and we don't want to have to deal with roads, and we don't want to have to deal with crime, and we don't want to have to deal with wondering if there's bad things in our food. So all of these things are regulated by the government, and it has made our lives sort of more automatic in certain situations. So in order to have more rules, you have to have more people implementing those rules. So the cabinet itself wears multiple hats. Individually, they are the head or the CEO of their executive department. Together, they can come together and advise the president as a whole. Sometimes it's on their specific issue, and sometimes it's on other policy issues. Members are appointed by the president and then approved by the Senate. And then they serve at the pleasure of the president, which means that he can fire them anytime he wants. This has been, the approval by Senate is a check that occurs, and lately it's been happening a lot where there will be filibuster cabinet posts and, cabinet appointments, and that's been a real difficult part of sort of the recent gridlock in Congress and in the United States government. When you choose the members of the department, you've got to, as the secretaries, you've got to sort of take into account a handful of things. Obviously, their part of your ideological considerations are taken into account by the president. You want them to mirror, if you're the president, you want them to mirror you, but you don't want them to be too extreme so that the Senate won't confirm them. A lot of times, the people are campaign supporters or opponents. A lot of times, they need to have a certain amount of experience. Certainly, you wouldn't want somebody who's never been a farmer or cared about farming rules to be the Secretary of Agriculture. They've got to be pleasing to special interest groups within that particular department. Race and gender, a lot of times Obama has been taking that into account to try to make it more equitable between minorities and women compared to just WASPs, male WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon men. Position on hot button issues within that department and personal characteristics. So also geography, I missed that. So for example, the former Iowa governor, Tom Vilsack, is the Secretary of Agriculture. Well, that makes sense because he's done a lot of, he's not been a farmer himself, but he was the governor of a state that is largely, has a large amount of rural issues. So he has definitely got the experience for that. This is, I guess, another way to look at the cabinet. The president has each one of these cabinet underneath them, and each one has a particular seal and a whole enormous amount of responsibility. Independent executive agencies headed by single administrators. They're appointed by the president, approved by the Senate as well. Again, they serve at the pleasure of the president. They submit their budget requests to the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. The EPA and Veterans Administration, these are independent executive agencies that that regulate things throughout the country, like, for example, the environment and the rules and sort of punishing people who don't follow the rules. They are independent, but yet they're still sort of served at the pleasure of the president, and they're still connected slightly. So the companies and the IRCs are headed by several commissioners, so it's not just one single person who's in charge. Again, they're appointed and approved by the President and the Senate, respectively. And they're regulated by Congress. So they have periodic authorization and appropriation hearings. Authorization means, we'll allow this particular thing to go forward, and appropriations is, here's the cash. The Food and Drug Administration, the Federal Reserve Board are examples of those commissions. Food and Drug Administration is in charge of, obviously, approval of drugs and particular foodstuffs throughout the country. Enterprises, Postal Service, and Amtrak, not at the pleasure of the president. They're fixed terms, so it's very sort of procedural in order to get people in and out of those. Regulating the civil service, there are a few laws that have occurred to regulate that. The Pendleton Act basically replaced a system of, hey, if you give me money for my campaign, or I'll go ahead and give you a position. So the Pendleton Act is a massive change in civil service. Civil service is just, working for the government. You are a bureaucrat. The Hatch Act and the revision of it basically said you can't be a candidate for public office. You can't influence election using your political or using your job. You can't get money from your subordinates, and you can't get any money from people who's had business with your particular office before. So it's trying to separate the civil service from elections itself. So the bureaucracy's job is to implement, turn law into action. You can either create rules or regulations, or they can spend money. What problems can vague laws and administrative discretion have on policy implementation? That just shows you, hopefully you can recognize that vague laws, which the Congress has largely done as of late, vague laws create the ability for bureaucrats to make an enormous amount of decisions. That didn't always used to be the way it was. Bureaucrats used to have a lot of sort of delegated responsibility from Congress, very specific about them, and there are laws that are that way. But the problem is that more and more Congress has sort of passed vague laws that they can take credit for, and yet the implementation is up to the people who work in the bureaucracies. So an example on the bottom here, you can see some implementation examples. Social Security Administration actually writes Social Security checks and sends them out to people. OSHA, the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, inspects job sites and investigates wrongdoing. The INS swears in new citizens, and the FAA monitors airline traffic and other issues there. So those are part of the air traffic controllers work there. Okay, that's it.